The late afternoon sun pressed down on Millbrook County Fair with a kind of oppressive heat that made asphalt shimmer and turned the air thick enough to chew. Jackson Cross stood beside his polished Harley-Davidson at the edge of the makeshift parking lot, arms crossed over his chest, watching families stream through the entrance gates with an expression that mixed nostalgia with something darker, more complicated. He was a man of imposing stature, 6'4", with shoulders that stretched the seams of his leather vest, a grizzled beard that touched his collarbone, and eyes the color of slate that had witnessed too much and forgotten nothing. They called him Hammer. The name had stuck 20 years ago after a bar fight where he'd used a tire iron to defend a woman being assaulted, and the efficiency with which he'd handled 3 attackers had earned him respect and reputation in equal measure. But today, standing in the shadow of the Ferris wheel with his cheerful rotation and children's laughter floating on superheated air, he felt the weight of his name pressing against his chest like a physical burden. 8 years. Today marked 8 years since his daughter Olivia had been found in a neighbor's basement, her small body positioned with care that suggested the killer had felt something approximating remorse. 8 years since Hammer's world had collapsed into before and after, since every moment of joy had been poisoned by the memory of what he'd lost and how catastrophically he'd failed to protect it. The Millbrook County Fair sprawled across 20 acres of dusty ground, a temporary city of canvas tents and mechanical rides that creaked and groaned with each rotation. The air carried competing scents: fried dough sweetness mixing with popcorn, salt cotton candy's sugar cloud colliding with the metallic tang of overheated machinery and diesel exhaust from generators that powered the midway. Music blared from different directions, creating cacophony that would have driven Hammer away on any other day. But the Hells Angels had volunteered as security after a series of vandalism incidents, and when your chapter president agreed to community service, you showed up whether your heart was in it or not. Vincent Viper Kane leaned against the ticket booth 30 yards away, his lean frame deceptively casual, while his eyes tracked every movement with the hypervigilance of someone who'd spent 20 years as a detective before corruption in the department had driven him to resign. He was 45 but looked older, stress and disillusionment etched into the lines around his mouth. His leather vest bore patches earned through loyalty and blood, but beneath the biker exterior lived a man who still believed in justice even when the system that was supposed to deliver it had failed. Dylan Ghost Rivers sat on a hay bale near the livestock pavilion, his massive frame making the bale look like a child's toy. His long gray braid hung down his back, and his weathered face carried the particular stillness of someone who'd learned early that invisibility was survival. Foster care had taught him to be quiet, to observe, to understand that adults were often dangerous, and trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now at 48, he used that hard-earned wariness to protect others, to be the guardian he had never had. Marcus Skull Reed circulated through the game booths, his wiry build and sharp features giving him the appearance of someone perpetually calculating angles. At 43, he was the youngest of Hammer's inner circle, but his observational skills were unmatched. He noticed details others missed: the nervous tick of a pickpocket, the way predators selected targets, the subtle tells that separated harmless from dangerous. His youth outreach work had taught him to read children's body language, to recognize when fear hid behind smiles. The Hells Angels' presence at the fair had generated predictable responses. Parents steered children wide-shooting nervous glances at the leather vests with their patches and insignia. Teenagers whispered and pointed, equal parts fascinated and intimidated. Fair workers maintained professional courtesy while clearly wishing the bikers would patrol somewhere less visible. Only the elderly seemed unbothered. They'd lived long enough to know that appearance and reality often diverged, that the scariest-looking people were sometimes the safest. Hammer's radio crackled with routine check-ins. His chapter had positioned 12 members around the fairground perimeter, creating overlapping fields of observation that would make any serious trouble immediately visible. It was overkill for a county fair, but Hammer ran his crew with military precision because sloppiness got people hurt. The discipline he'd learned in the Marines 30 years ago had never left, had only been refined by decades of living on society's edges, where mistakes had permanent consequences. His phone buzzed. A text from his ex-wife Margaret. "Thinking of you today. I know it's hard." She would have been 17. Hammer stared at the words until they blurred. 17. Old enough to drive, to have boyfriends, to roll her eyes at his overprotective instincts. old enough to be preparing for senior year, applying to colleges, planning futures that would never exist. He shoved the phone back in his pocket without responding. Because what could he say that Margaret didn't already know? They'd divorced 3 years after Olivia's death, their marriage unable to survive the weight of grief and blame that had crushed whatever love had once existed. A child's shriek cut through his thoughts. Laughter, not fear. A little boy being chased by his father near the carousel. Hammer watched them with expression carefully neutral, his chest tight with envy and loss. Olivia had loved carousels, had insisted on riding the same painted horse, every time had named it Buttercup, despite Hammer's suggestion that horses should have stronger names. He'd given in because her joy had been more important than his ego, because making his daughter happy had been the simplest and most profound purpose his life had ever known. Movement in his peripheral vision pulled his attention. A small figure was weaving through the crowd with desperate urgency, moving against the general flow of fairgoers, with purpose that seemed out of place among the leisurely wandering. Hammer's focus sharpened his body language, shifting from casual observation to predatory alertness in the space between heartbeats. She was perhaps 9 years old, her bright yellow sundress a splash of color that made her visible even at distance. Dark hair pulled into pigtails bounced with each frantic step. One foot was bare, the other wore a pink sandal with a broken strap that dragged behind her. Her face, flushed from exertion and heat, showed terror mixed with fierce determination that belonged on someone decades older. Hammer straightened from his slouch against the Harley, his hands dropping to his sides, every instinct firing alerts that something was catastrophically wrong. Children ran at fairs, chasing friends, racing to favorite rides, burning energy in the mindless joy that defined childhood. But this girl wasn't running towards something. She was running away, and more troublingly, she was running directly toward the Hells Angels, toward men whose appearance usually sent children in the opposite direction. Viper noticed her simultaneously, his body tensing, hand moving unconsciously toward the radio clipped to his belt. Ghost rose from the hay bale with surprising fluidity for his size, his gray eyes tracking the girl's trajectory. Skull emerged from the game booth area, having somehow sensed the shift in atmosphere that preceded crisis. The girl skidded to a halt 3 feet from Hammer, her small chest heaving, breath coming in ragged gasps that suggested she'd run farther than her small legs should have managed. Her eyes were huge, glistening with tears she was fighting desperately to control. Her lower lip trembled, but her jaw was set with determination that made Hammer's heart clench painfully. She looked up at him, this towering monolith of leather and muscle who made grown men nervous, and for a moment she seemed to wave her childhood fear of strangers battling with whatever desperate need had driven her here. Then something hardened in her expression, some internal decision made, and she took a shaky breath that seemed to draw strength from sources she shouldn't have needed to access. Her voice came out clear despite its tremor, each word landing with devastating precision. "Sir, he has my panties on him." The fairground noise didn't stop. The carousel continued its rotation. The games still blared their come-ons. Children still shrieked with laughter. But in the small circle around Hammer and the girl, silence fell with weight of physical presence. Viper went absolutely still, his detective's mind already cataloging implications and calculating next steps. Ghost's expression remained neutral, but his hands had curled into fists. Skull's sharp features tightened, his breathing shallow and controlled. Hammer felt the world tilt sideways, felt 8 years of grief and guilt, and rage surge up his throat like poison. The words the girl had spoken weren't childish complaint or playground dispute. They were confession, accusation, cry for help compressed into 7 syllables that changed everything. He knelt slowly, deliberately, making his massive frame smaller and less threatening. His voice, when it emerged, was surprisingly gentle. Years of speaking to Olivia, teaching him how to communicate with terrified children. "What did you say, sweetheart?" The girl's composure wavered but didn't break. Her small hands twisted in the hem of her yellow dress knuckles, going white with pressure. "Coach Thornton, my PE teacher. He took them from my backpack at school yesterday. I saw him put them in his jacket pocket today. He's here." Behind the big tent near the Ferris wheel, the name hit Hammer like a physical blow. David Thornton wasn't some anonymous predator, some suspicious stranger that community alarm systems were designed to detect. He was elementary school PE coach, the man who taught children sports and teamwork, who volunteered for school events and coached Little League on weekends. He was married, respected, the kind of person parents trusted implicitly with their children's safety and development. Viper moved closer, his voice tight with control that barely contained fury. Thornton, the coach, the guy who won County Educator Award last year. The girl nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, but her voice remaining steady. He made me stay after class last week, asked me questions about my body, if I had boyfriend, if I knew what certain things meant. I felt weird, but I didn't know what to say. Then yesterday I noticed my underwear was missing from my gym bag. Today I saw him at the fair, and I saw them in his jacket pocket when he was buying cotton candy. The ones with strawberries, they're mine. Hammer's mind was racing, calculating, trying to process information that felt both alien and horrifyingly familiar. Olivia's face flashed in his memory, her worried expression when she told him she felt uncomfortable around adults in her life, her hesitation when certain people's names came up, her gradual withdrawal that he'd attributed to pre-adolescent moodiness rather than recognizing as distress signal she'd been sending. He'd been working long hours with the club, then had prioritized brotherhood and business over the subtle changes in his daughter's behavior. When she tried to tell him something was wrong, he dismissed it as childhood anxiety, had told her she was safe, had failed to investigate because investigating would have required acknowledging that danger existed in places he'd believed were secure. 2 weeks later, she'd been dead. The neighbor, Mr. Peterson, had been investigated, had endured community suspicion and police scrutiny, but evidence had mysteriously disappeared and the case had gone cold. Peterson had moved away, and Hammer had been left with grief and questions that aided him like acid for 8 years. Ghost's voice cut through Hammer's spiraling thoughts, surprisingly soft despite his imposing size. She came to us, not her parents, not the police, not teachers. She looked at us and decided we were the ones who'd listen. That's not coincidence. That's desperation. Viper had his phone out, scrolling rapidly, his detective instincts overriding his current life as a biker. His face darkened as he read. David Thornton, 38 years old, married to Claire Thornton, no children. Teaches at Millbrook Elementary, been there 7 years. Coaches girls softball, volunteers with youth church groups, sits on Parks and Recreation Committee. He looked up, his expression grim. He's embedded, the kind of predator who builds reputation specifically to access victims. If he's bold enough to carry evidence at a public fair, he's confident he won't be caught. That means he's done this before and gotten away with it. Skull knelt beside Hammer, his sharp eyes studying the girl's face with intensity that was clinical rather than threatening. What's your name? Emma. Emma Hayes. Emma, where's your mom? The girl's composure cracked slightly, fresh tears welling. She works at the Route 9 diner, double shift. Won't be off until 10 tonight. I came to the fair with the neighbor kids, but I lost them in the crowd. I've been alone, and then I saw Coach Thornton, and I got scared, and I saw you, and you looked like you'd believe me. The admission landed with terrible weight. She was 9 years old, alone at a crowded fair, had witnessed her abuser, and had made calculated decision that scary-looking bikers were safer than the adults who were supposed to protect her. The judgment spoke volumes about her experiences with authority figures, about how many times she'd been dismissed or disbelieved, about the desperation that had driven her to approach men who made most children instinctively retreat. Hammer felt something ancient and primal ignite in his chest. This child had walked through her terror to ask for help, had chosen to trust when trust had clearly been weaponized against her. He would not fail her the way he'd failed Olivia. He would not dismiss her words or doubt her perception or prioritize convenience over her safety. Emma, I need you to listen very carefully. You did exactly the right thing coming to us. You are not alone anymore. We are going to protect you, and we are going to stop Coach Thornton. Do you understand? Emma nodded, her small hand reaching out tentatively to grip the edge of Hammer's vest. The gesture was heartbreaking in its vulnerability, this child seeking anchor from a stranger, because the people who should have been her anchors had failed her. Viper was already moving, his voice dropping into command mode that came from decades of law enforcement. We need to call Sheriff Morrison. Handle this through proper channels. If we go vigilante on a respected community member without evidence, Morrison plays golf with Thornton every Sunday. They're in the same Rotary Club, both deacons at First Methodist. You think Morrison's going to believe a 9-year-old over his drinking buddy? The statement came from Ghost, whose cynicism about institutional protection had been earned through brutal childhood experiences in systems that claim to safeguard children while routinely failing them. Skull was scanning the crowd, his sharp eyes searching for threats. We can't grab a teacher at a county fair in front of witnesses. There are kids everywhere, parents watching security cameras. We need strategy. Hammer stood keeping Emma close in his hand, protective on her shoulder. Then we find him. We locate Thornton, we assess the situation, and we make sure Emma stays safe while we figure out next steps. Viper, you're right about needing evidence, but Ghost is also right about Morrison. We need to move carefully, but we need to move. His radio crackled. Another club member checking in from the North Perimeter, routine traffic that now felt surreal against the backdrop of the crisis unfolding. Hammer acknowledged the check-in automatically, his mind racing through scenarios and contingencies, years of tactical thinking applied to a situation that was simultaneously familiar and unprecedented. Emma tugged his vest gently, her voice small. He's over there, by the game booths. I saw him 5 minutes ago. Hammer followed her pointing finger across the fairground to area where carnival games lined pathway ring, toss, dart throws, water gun races, the kind of skillfully rigged amusements that separated tourists from their money while providing illusion of winnable prizes. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the man Emma had described. And then he saw him. David Thornton stood near the baseball toss, his appearance so perfectly wholesome, it could have been calculated for maximum trustworthiness. Clean cut with sandy hair, styled conservatively, wearing khakis and a light blue jacket. Despite the heat, his smile was warm and engaging as he chatted with a group of parents whose children clustered around him. He looked like every stereotype of a good teacher, a safe adult, the kind of person communities celebrated and children were taught to respect. But Hammer's eyes, trained by decades of reading people whose survival depended on deception, caught details others would miss. The jacket was too heavy for the weather worn specifically to conceal something. Thornton's eyes weren't tracking the conversation with the parents, they were scanning the crowd, watching children with attention that went beyond casual observation. And there was tension in his posture, subtle but present, the coiled readiness of someone anticipating interruption or discovery. Viper followed Hammer's gaze and swore under his breath. That's him, looking every inch the pillar of the community. They began moving through the crowd, not running, but walking one with purpose that cleared path through fairgoers who instinctively moved aside for the four large men in leather vests. Emma stayed close to Hammer, her hand gripping his vest, her small legs working double time to match his stride. People stared, whispered, but Hammer ignored them, his entire focus narrowed to the man ahead, who had no idea that justice was approaching in the form of bikers he'd probably dismissed as thugs. Thornton saw them coming. Hammer watched the moment of recognition, saw the coach's smile falter fractionally before recovery snapped it back into place. But in that micro-expression, Hammer read everything: guilt calculation, fear being rapidly buried under performance of innocence. They reached him as he was saying goodbye to the parents, his voice carrying practice warmth. Well, I should get going. You folks enjoy the fair. Hammer stepped into his path, not aggressively, but definitively, creating wall of leather and muscle that couldn't be ignored. Emma stayed partially hidden behind him, visible but protected. Coach Thornton. Thornton's smile remained fixed, but his eyes went flat, assessing. Can I help you, gentlemen? I'm afraid I don't. This young lady has something to tell you. Thornton's gaze dropped to Emma, and something flickered across his features. Surprise, anger, fear, all buried so quickly that someone not looking for it would have missed it entirely. His recovery was impressive, his expression shifting to concerned confusion. Emma, your mother know you're talking to these gentlemen. The pause before gentlemen carried clear implication. Bikers were dangerous. Emma was being manipulated. He was the concerned adult trying to protect her from bad influences. It was masterful performance, exactly the kind of deflection that had probably worked countless times before. Hammer's voice came out cold and flat, stripped of the gentleness he'd used with Emma. Answer the question, coach. Where's Emma's property? Thornton laughed, but nervous edge crept in, barely perceptible crack in his facade. I don't know what you mean. Emma, honey, did you lose something? Let me help you find your parents. You have her underwear in your jacket pocket. The pair with strawberries. Explain that. The fairground sounds seemed to dim conversations around them, stuttering and stopping as people registered confrontation unfolding. Parents pulled their children closer, instinctively sensing danger without understanding its source. Thornton's face went through a rapid series of expressions. Confusion hurt, dawning horror, each one perfectly calibrated for his audience. That's, that's an outrageous accusation, Emma, sweetheart. These men are confusing you. Sometimes kids misplace things, and I saw you take them from my backpack yesterday after PE class. I saw them in your pocket today when you bought cotton candy. They're mine and you stole them. Emma's voice rang clear despite her trembling, carrying across the space with conviction that cut through Thornton's performance. Nearby fairgoers were fully tuned in now, a small crowd gathering, phones appearing as people recorded what was rapidly becoming public spectacle. Thornton's mask slipped further, desperation bleeding through. This is absurd. I'm a teacher, for God's sake. I would never. Then you won't mind turning out your pockets. Should be easy to prove Emma's wrong if you've got nothing to hide. The voice came from behind them, heavy with authority that made everyone turn. Sheriff Grant Morrison pushed through the gathering crowd, his bulk impressive despite middle age, his uniform crisp despite the heat, his hand resting casually on his service weapon, in posture that was both reassuring to some and threatening to others. Morrison was 55, red-faced from high blood pressure and probable alcoholism, with receding hairline and mustache that had gone from brown to gray over his 30-year career in law enforcement. He'd been sheriff for 12 years, elected repeatedly on platform of traditional values and tough-on-crime rhetoric that played well in rural Montana. His eyes, small and shrewd, moved from the bikers to Thornton to Emma with assessment that was rapid and calculating. Hammer felt Emma shrink behind him, her hand tightening on his vest. He read her body language instantly. This wasn't normal childhood wariness of police. This was specific fear recognition that Morrison represented threat rather than protection. The sheriff's expression had already hardened into judgment before he'd heard full story, his body language telegraphing whose side he'd chosen. What's the problem here, gentlemen? The word gentleman carried different inflection than Thornton's usage, not implied threat, but overt sarcasm, dismissal wrapped in formal language. Viper stepped forward, his years as a detective giving him credibility with law enforcement, even if his current lifestyle complicated that relationship. Sheriff Morrison, this child has made serious allegation against Coach March Thornton. She claims he stole her underwear from her school backpack and currently has them in his jacket pocket. Morrison's face cycled through surprise to disbelief to anger in rapid succession. That's ridiculous. Coach Thornton is respected educator, volunteers his time, coaches kids' sports. You're telling me you believe he'd steal a child's, that he'd do something like that? I'm telling you the child made the allegation and it needs to be investigated. Proper protocol would be to ask him to voluntarily empty his pockets or obtain a warrant for search. Morrison's expression suggested Viper had proposed something obscene. We don't search upstanding citizens based on wild accusations from confused children and biker harassment. Emma, sweetheart. He crouched to her level voice, going syrupy with false kindness that made Hammer's skin crawl. Sometimes kids get mixed up. Sometimes they see one thing and remember it differently. Did these men tell you to say these things about Coach Thornton? Emma's voice emerged small but defiant. Nobody told me anything. He has my underwear, the ones with strawberries on them. He took them yesterday and I saw them today in his jacket. Search him and you'll see. Morrison straightened his face, hardening, the false kindness evaporating. Young lady, making false accusations against teachers is serious business. Coach Thornton has dedicated his life to helping children like you. Now I think you need to apologize and we'll forget this whole misunderstanding. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by drama unfolding like reality television in their midst. Phones captured everything, the encounter being documented and already streaming to social media feeds, where it would be analyzed and debated by people who hadn't been there and didn't understand the stakes. Thornton, sensing Morrison's support, allowed hurt confusion to dominate his expression. Sheriff, I don't want to press charges. Emma's a good kid, just confused. These men, he gestured dismissively at the bikers. They're probably trying to cause trouble, using her as excuse. I'm willing to overlook this if they'll just leave. The offer was strategic genius. It positioned Thornton as magnanimous victim, turned bikers into aggressors, and gave Morris an excuse to de-escalate without investigating. Hammer watched the play unfold with sick recognition of how easily truth could be buried under performance of respectability. Morrison's hand moved to his radio. "I think we need to have these gentlemen removed from the fairgrounds. Creating disturbance, harassing citizens." "Sheriff?" The voice came from the edge of the crowd, female and firm. A woman pushed through the gathered fairgoers, her uniform marking her as Deputy Lisa Chen. She was 32, Asian American, with pulled back hair, an expression that suggested she'd heard enough to make her uncomfortable with how the situation was being handled. "Sir, if there's been an allegation of child sexual abuse, material possession protocol requires investigation regardless of the accused's community standing. We can't just dismiss it." Morrison's face went purple, anger barely contained. "Deputy Chen, I'll handle this. Return to your patrol." Chen didn't move, her jaw set. "With respect, sir, if something happens to this child and it comes out, we ignored her allegation because the accused was someone we knew. That's on us. I'm requesting permission to ask Mr. Thornton to voluntarily empty his pockets. If he's innocent, it'll clear this up immediately." The crowd murmured approval, the suggestion of basic fairness resonating with people who hadn't yet chosen sides. Morrison was trapped by his deputy's logic, and the growing audience forced to either allow the search or reveal his bias so obviously that even sympathetic observers would question his judgment. Thornton's expression had gone cold, his pleasant mask slipping to reveal calculation beneath. "I don't have to submit to search without warrant. This is harassment, pure and simple. I'm calling my lawyer." He pulled out his phone with movements that were too quick, too defensive, the panic of someone whose fortress was cracking. But before he could dial, Emma's voice cut through the tension. "His jacket, the right pocket. You'll see them, they have my name written inside with permanent marker, because I always lose things. EMMA in red letters. Look, and you'll know I'm not lying." The specificity of the detail landed like bomb. Morrison looked trapped. Chen looked determined. Thornton looked cornered. The crowd pressed closer, sensing climax to drama that had transformed their mundane fair visit into something they'd recount for years. Hammer watched Thornton's hand slide toward his jacket pocket, watched his fingers brush the fabric, watched calculation flash across his face as he weighed options that were all terrible. And in that moment, Hammer knew with absolute certainty that Emma was telling the truth, that this respected teacher was predator, who'd operated in plain sight, and that the system designed to protect children was about to fail again. Morrison made his decision, stepping between Chen and Thornton. "That's enough. Mr. Thornton, you're free to go. Deputy Chen will discuss your insubordination later. As for you," he turned to Hammer and his crew, "you're done here. Leave the fairgrounds immediately or I'll have you arrested for harassment and disturbing the peace." Emma's small voice emerged one final time, breaking with desperation. "Please, please, just look. Why won't anyone just look?" But Morrison was already escorting Thornton away, the coach's lawyer already being summoned, the machinery of protection closing ranks around one of their own. Chen stood frozen, her expression showing internal war between duty and authority, knowing she was witnessing injustice but lacking power to stop it. The crowd began to disperse, the drama over, without satisfying resolution, people returning to their entertainment with uncomfortable awareness that something wrong had occurred, but lacking framework to address it. Within minutes, the confrontation would become story, then rumor, then forgotten footnote, to evening's festivities. Hammer looked down at Emma, this brave child who'd risked everything to speak truth and been dismissed, and felt familiar fury building. 8 years ago, Olivia had tried to warn him. He hadn't listened, and she died. He wouldn't make that mistake again. His voice was low, meant only for Emma and his crew. "This isn't over. We'll find another way." Emma looked up at him with eyes too old for her face, hope and resignation warring in her expression. She'd been betrayed by the system, dismissed by authority, her truth buried under respectability and privilege. But she'd found unexpected allies in the scariest-looking men at the fair, and some instinct told her they wouldn't abandon her the way everyone else had. "Promise." Hammer crouched to her level, his massive hand gentle on her shoulder. "I promise, and I don't break my promises." Skull moved through the fairground with purpose that looked casual to observers but carried military precision in its execution. His lean frame wove between game booths and food stalls, his sharp eyes scanning faces, his mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating routes and contingencies. Finding Rebecca Hayes meant leaving the immediate crisis temporarily, but Emma couldn't be protected properly without her mother present, and the legal complications of 4 bikers holding custody of a child without parental knowledge would give Morrison exactly the ammunition he needed to bury this completely. The Route 9 diner sat 15 miles outside town, a chrome-sided institution that had served truckers and locals for 40 years. Skull's bike ate up the highway miles, his thoughts racing faster than the engine beneath him. He'd worked youth outreach long enough to recognize the particular desperation in Emma's voice when she'd mentioned her mother, the resignation that suggested she'd tried to get adult help before and been dismissed. Children didn't run to strangers unless family had already failed them. The diner's parking lot was half full with 18-wheelers and pickup trucks, the building's neon sign buzzing with electrical hum that competed with insects drawn to the light. Skull killed his engine and dismounted his leather vest, an imposing presence drawing immediate attention when he pushed through the glass door. Conversations, stuttered heads turned the universal wariness that greeted bikers in civilian spaces. Behind the counter, a woman in her mid-30s moved with exhausted efficiency born from too many double shifts and too little sleep. Rebecca Hayes was thin to the point of gaunt, her blonde hair pulled into practical ponytail that revealed premature gray at her temples. Her uniform was clean, but faded, her shoes worn down at the heels, her hands showing the particular roughness of someone who spent hours washing dishes and bussing tables. She looked up as Skull approached, her expression cycling through surprise to apprehension to defensive readiness. "Can I help you?" Her voice carried edge of someone used to handling difficult customers preparing for confrontation or harassment from the large biker who'd just invaded her workplace. Skull kept his voice low, aware of the audience listening from nearby booths. "Rebecca Hayes, I need to talk to you about your daughter, Emma. It's urgent." The color drained from Rebecca's face, her hand going to her throat in gesture of pure maternal terror. "What happened? Is she hurt? Where is she?" "She's safe. She's with my friends at the county fair, but something happened that requires you there immediately. I'll explain on the way." Rebecca was already untying her apron, her hands shaking, years of waitress composure shattering under fear for her child. The diner manager emerged from the kitchen, his expression showing annoyance at the disruption. "Rebecca, your shift doesn't end for 4 more hours. You can't just—" "My daughter needs me. I'm leaving. Fire me if you want." She grabbed her purse from beneath the counter and followed Skull outside, her exhaustion temporarily overridden by adrenaline. She stopped when she saw the motorcycle hesitation flickering across her face. "I've never ridden on one of those. Hold on tight, lean when I lean, don't put your feet down until I tell you." And Mrs. Hayes, whatever you're imagining about what happened, it's probably worse. The ride back to Millbrook took 12 minutes. Rebecca's arms wrapped around Skull's midsection with grip that suggested she was holding on to more than just the bike. He felt her trembling, transmitted through his leather vest, felt the way her breathing hitched. When he accelerated, felt the weight of maternal terror that every parent carried just below the surface of their daily existence. The knowledge that their children were vulnerable and the world was dangerous, and sometimes those two facts collided in ways that shattered everything. When they pulled into the fairground parking lot, Rebecca dismounted with shaking legs, her eyes immediately scanning for Emma. Skull led her to the edge of the carnival area where Hammer stood with Emma still close beside him, Viper and Ghost forming protective semicircle. The setting sun painted everything in orange and purple, beautiful light for terrible circumstances. Emma saw her get there and ran, her small legs carrying her across the distance with desperate speed. Rebecca dropped to her knees and caught her daughter in an embrace that was fierce and trembling, her face buried in Emma's hair, her shoulders shaking with sobs she'd been holding back during the ride. "Baby, oh God, baby, are you okay? What happened?" Emma pulled back, her face showing complex emotions that no 9-year-old should have to navigate, relief at her mother's presence, mixed with fear that she wouldn't be believed, love tangled with anticipated disappointment. "Mom, I need to tell you something, and you need to actually listen this time." The "this time" carried weight of previous dismissals, confirmation that Emma had tried before to communicate something important and been ignored. Rebecca's face showed flash of shame before defensive walls began constructing themselves, the universal adult response to being told they'd failed. Hammer moved closer, his presence both protective and authoritative. His voice when it emerged was gentle, but carried steel beneath. Mrs. Hayes, your daughter made serious allegation against her PE teacher. She claims Coach Thornton stole her underwear from her school backpack and is currently carrying them as trophy. She came to us because she felt we'd believe her when other adults wouldn't. Rebecca's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, dawning horror. She looked at Emma, searching her daughter's face for signs of fabrication or imagination, wanting desperately for this to be misunderstanding rather than truth. Emma, sweetie, Coach Thornton has been so kind to you. He tutors you for free helps with your reading volunteers his time. Are you absolutely sure you didn't just misplace your things and see someone else who looked like him? The rationalization came easily, automatically, the cognitive dissonance of discovering that someone you'd trusted was dangerous, manifesting as denial. Emma's face closed, disappointment replacing hope, her small body going rigid in her mother's arms. I knew you wouldn't believe me. That's why I went to them. She pulled away from Rebecca, moving back toward Hammer with body language that communicated where she felt safer. The rejection landed like physical blow, Rebecca's face crumpling with hurt and confusion and mounting awareness that she just failed some crucial test. Skull's voice cut through the tension, rough with controlled emotion. Ma'am, I grew up in foster care, 13 homes before I aged out of the system. I learned what adults sound like when they're choosing comfort over truth, when they'd rather believe convenient lies than face hard reality. Your daughter gathered every ounce of courage she had to tell you something terrifying. The worst thing you can do right now is make her regret speaking up. The words landed like hammer blows, each one dismantling Rebecca's defenses, forcing her to confront the possibility that her judgment had been catastrophically wrong. She looked at Emma, really looked, and saw the fear and desperation and betrayal written across her daughter's small face. Baby, I'm sorry. Tell me everything. Emma's voice emerged small and halting, detailing Coach Thornton's inappropriate questions, the missing underwear, seeing them in his pocket, at the fair approaching the bikers for help, Sheriff Morrison dismissing her allegations and protecting Thornton. With each revelation, Rebecca's face went paler, her hands trembling. Maternal instinct, warring with social conditioning that insisted respected authority figures couldn't be predators. Viper had been working his phone throughout the reunion, his detective instincts and remaining law enforcement contacts providing research capabilities the others lacked. His expression had grown progressively darker, his jaw tightening with each new piece of information he uncovered. Finally, he approached his tablet, showing documents and news clippings that painted disturbing pattern. I need you all to see this. He pulled up article from 3 years ago, small piece buried in local news section about family relocating to Oregon. The Mitchell family, parents and daughter Sarah, moving for better opportunities. Nothing remarkable on surface, but Viper had dug deeper, had found the truth buried in court records, in sealed case files that shouldn't have been accessible, but were for someone who knew where to look. Sarah Mitchell was 9 years old when her family left Millbrook. Her parents filed initial complaint with Sheriff Morrison about inappropriate conduct by elementary school teacher. Case was opened, then mysteriously closed within 48 hours. Family accepted $10,000 settlement from school district in exchange for non-disclosure agreement and immediate relocation. He swiped to another document, this one showing different name. Jenny Rodriguez. Family moved to Arizona 2 years ago. Similar pattern complaint, filed case closed, family relocated with financial settlement. Katie Sullivan moved to Wyoming 18 months ago. Same story. 3 families, 3 daughters, all around age 9, 3 complaints against elementary school staff that were all buried. Rebecca's voice emerged barely above whisper. You're saying this has happened before, that other families knew, and nobody stopped him? I'm saying Morrison has been covering for someone for years, paying families to leave quietly rather than investigating properly. And I'd bet everything I own that the teacher they were complaining about was David Thornton. Hammer's hands had curled into fists, his breathing carefully controlled, rage building in his chest like pressure in a sealed container. The pattern was sickeningly familiar. Olivia's case had involved similar mysterious evidence, disappearances, similar resistance from law enforcement to seriously investigate similar suggestions that pursuing justice would only traumatize everyone involved. He'd been too grief-stricken then to recognize corruption, had accepted official explanations because the alternative was confronting the possibility that the system designed to protect his daughter had actively failed her. We need to contact those families, get their statements, build case that shows pattern Morrison can't dismiss. Viper was already dialing, his phone pressed to his ear as he moved away for privacy. Ghost remained positioned where he could watch both the fairground entrance and the parking lot, his body language radiating threat to anyone who might approach with hostile intent. Skull stood beside Emma, his presence offering protection without demanding interaction. Rebecca pulled Emma close again, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, baby. I should have listened. When you said Coach Thornton made you uncomfortable when you didn't want to go to tutoring anymore, I thought you were just being difficult. I thought he was helping, and you were being ungrateful. I made you go back to his house. Oh God, I sent you back to him." Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder, 9 years of childhood certainty that parents would protect her crumbling under weight of evidence that adults made mistakes, that trust could be misplaced, that safety was never guaranteed. Viper returned, his expression grim. "I reached Sarah Mitchell's mother. She broke down, confirmed everything. Thornton molested Sarah repeatedly over a 6-month period. When they finally reported it to Morrison, he convinced them that pressing charges would traumatize Sarah more than the abuse already had. Told them trial would destroy their daughter's privacy, suggested quietly leaving town was better for everyone. School district paid them off. They signed the NDA and they've lived with guilt ever since." His voice hardened. "She's willing to testify. Wants to break the NDA, wants to stop him before he hurts more children. She's been carrying this for 3 years, watching news from Millbrook, terrified she'd see story about another victim, and knowing she could have prevented it." Hammer's radio crackled. Ghost's voice came through low and urgent. "Boss, we have movement. Thornton just left the fairground heading to parking lot. He's alone, moving fast." The opportunity presented itself with clarity that felt almost providential. Thornton isolated departing scene, potentially carrying evidence. Hammer made decision in seconds, weighing legality against necessity, choosing effectiveness over procedure. Ghost tail him. "Don't lose sight. Everyone else, we move now." Rebecca started to protest maternal instinct to keep Emma close, warring with understanding that what came next wasn't appropriate for her daughter to witness. "Emma stays with Skull. Rebecca, you're coming with us. You need to see this." They moved through the parking lot with coordinated precision born from years of operating as unit. Ghost's massive frame was surprisingly stealthy, tracking Thornton from distance while remaining invisible among the cars and trucks. Hammer, Viper, and Rebecca followed at interval that maintained observation without revealing pursuit. Thornton reached older model Honda Civic, his movements jerky with stress, constantly checking his surroundings. His pleasant teacher mask had completely disintegrated, replaced by expression of cornered animal calculating escape routes. He unlocked the vehicle, started to enter, then paused. His hand went to his jacket pocket, pulled out something small and fabric, looked at it with expression mixing satisfaction and fear. Ghost's voice came through radio. "He's got something." Pulled it from jacket, looking at it now. "Can't see clearly from this angle, but it's small cloth." Thornton glanced around one final time, then opened his glove compartment and shoved the item inside, slamming it closed with force that suggested finality. He sat in his car for a long moment, hands gripping steering wheel, visible tension in his shoulders. Then he pulled out his phone and made call of his mouth moving in animated conversation that looked aggressive, even from distance. After 5 minutes, he ended the call and drove away, his Honda disappearing into evening traffic. The parking lot settled into temporary quiet, other fairgoers still enjoying rides and games, unaware of drama that had unfolded in their midst. Hammer approached Thornton's vehicle with Viper beside him, Rebecca trailing behind with expression mixing horror and determination. Ghost materialized from shadows, his lock-picking tools already in hand before anyone requested them. "Breaking and entering. Whatever we find won't be admissible in court." Viper's detective training warred with his current reality legal knowledge, creating hesitation even as moral certainty demanded action. Hammer's voice was flat, absolute. "Then we make sure it gets to someone who can use it properly. We're not letting evidence disappear the way it did with Olivia." The name hung in air between them, weight of Hammer's loss, lending gravity to decision that crossed legal lines. Ghost worked the lock with practiced efficiency, his large hands surprisingly delicate with tools. Within 30 seconds, the door clicked open. The glove compartment yielded its secrets immediately. A gallon Ziploc bag, the kind used for organizing or travel, filled with small fabric items that were instantly, horrifyingly recognizable. Children's underwear, at least 12 pairs each one, carefully labeled with masking tape bearing dates and initials. Pink with hearts, purple with stars, yellow with flowers, white with lace trim. The variety suggested collections spanning years, trophies taken from multiple victims whose names and faces Thornton had documented with Predator's meticulous record-keeping. Rebecca made sound like wounded animal, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Hammer pulled his phone and began photographing everything from multiple angles, documenting placement and labels, ensuring no detail was missed. Viper did the same, his detective instincts creating mental chain of custody, even though official procedures had been abandoned. There, strawberries, EMMA in red marker. The pair Emma had described sat near the top of the bag, confirmation that this wasn't misunderstanding or confusion or childish imagination. This was systematic predation, documented and organized evidence of crimes spanning years that Morrison had actively suppressed. Step away from the vehicle. The voice came from behind them, female and carrying authority that made everyone freeze. Deputy Lisa Chen stood 10 feet away, her hand resting on her service weapon, her expression unreadable in the fading light. Her radio was clipped to her belt, her phone in her other hand, decision point visible in her posture. Hammer straightened slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening, calculating whether Chen represented threat or opportunity. Viper remained crouched by the open car, his body language communicating submission to authority, even as his mind raced through legal defenses for what they'd done. Chen approached carefully, her eyes moving from the bikers to the open glove compartment, to the bag of children's underwear clearly visible inside. Her breath caught her professional composure cracking to reveal revulsion and rage beneath. How many? Her voice had gone quiet, tight with emotion she was barely controlling. Viper answered his detective background, recognizing kindred spirit even across jurisdictional divide. 12 that we can see, all labeled bold with dates and initials. This is trophy collection from serial predator. And Sheriff Morrison just let him walk away when Emma accused him. Chen closed her eyes, her jaw working internal struggle visible in the tension radiating from her frame. When she opened her eyes, something had shifted. Decision made, a lane crossed, consequences accepted. I received anonymous tip about suspicious vehicle in fair parking lot. Arrived to investigate, discovered vehicle door already opened, observed evidence in plain sight. You three were never here. I found this during legal search following legitimate tip. She pulled out her phone and began taking official photographs, documenting scene with procedural correctness that would stand up in court. Her hands shook slightly, but her documentation was thorough, professional, exactly what prosecutor would need to build case. Hammer felt something loosen in his chest, hope warring with learned cynicism about whether anyone in authority would actually help rather than obstruct. Morrison will fight you on this. He'll claim you exceeded authority, that evidence is tainted, that you're manufacturing charges. Chen's smile was bitter. Morrison has been dirty since before I joined the force. I've known it, suspected it, watched him bury cases and protect connected people for 3 years. I stayed quiet because bucking the sheriff gets you fired, blacklisted, destroyed. But I didn't become cop to protect predators. If this cost me my career, so be it. She finished photographing, then carefully bagged the evidence, using proper chain of custody procedures, sealing it in evidence bags from her patrol vehicle, and documenting every step. When she was finished, she turned to face them. I'm calling FBI. Child predation across state lines, pattern of corruption, suppressing investigations, evidence of multiple victims. This is federal case now. Morrison can't bury what he doesn't control. Rebecca's voice emerged shaky but determined. Will they believe Emma? Will they actually investigate instead of protecting him? FBI takes child exploitation seriously. They'll interview Emma properly with trauma specialists present. They'll investigate every name on these labels, track down every victim. This is what Morrison should have done years ago. This is justice, even if it's late. The words landed with weight of promise, fragile hope that perhaps the system could still function when individuals chose integrity over convenience. Chen pulled out her radio, calling for backup, an FBI contact, her voice professional and controlled despite the magnitude of what she was setting in motion. Hammer's phone buzzed, text from Ghost. Thornton meeting with Morrison at sheriff's office. Looks heated. They know something's wrong. The corruption was unraveling, Thornton and Morrison both recognizing that their careful arrangement was collapsing. They would fight back with lawyers and political connections, and manufactured outrage would paint themselves as victims of biker harassment and overzealous deputy. The battle was just beginning, and it would get uglier before resolution emerged. But for the first time since Emma had uttered those 7 devastating words, Hammer felt momentum shifting in the right direction. Evidence was secured, ally within law enforcement was acting, pattern of victimization was documented. The machinery of justice was grinding slowly into motion, and while it might be late and imperfect, it was finally moving. Chen finished her calls and turned to them. FBI is sending agents from Helena. They'll be here in 90 minutes. I need formal statements from everyone, Emma Rebecca U4. Everything that happened today, documented properly. Morrison will try to seize this case, claim jurisdiction, bury it like the others. We move fast before he can interfere. Word was spreading through the fairground with viral intensity that social media accelerated. Phones captured everything, uploaded footage to platforms where it mutated through sharing and commentary. By the time full story reached the crowd, details had warped. Some versions painted bikers as heroes, others as vigilantes, manufacturing crisis. Still others suggested elaborate conspiracy to frame innocent teacher. Thornton appeared at fairground entrance, flanked by expensive lawyers who'd arrived with speed that suggested prearranged emergency contact. He was playing wounded innocent to gathering media, his voice carrying hurt confusion to cameras that broadcast live. I've dedicated my life to helping children. These bikers attacked me, planted evidence, terrorized a confused little girl into false accusations. This is character assassination, pure and simple. The performance was masterful, designed to shift narrative from predator caught to innocent man persecuted. His lawyers reinforced the message, threatening lawsuits against everyone involved, suggesting massive civil rights violations and prosecutorial misconduct before charges had even been filed. Morrison stood beside Thornton, his authority lending legitimacy to claims of innocence, his presence communicating to community that their sheriff believed the coach. The message was clear: trust established authority over biker outsiders, believe respectable, educator over traumatized child, maintain social order, even if it meant ignoring uncomfortable truth. Emma watched the press conference from distance, her small face showing comprehension beyond her years. She'd told the truth, had done everything right, and now watched the system she'd been taught to trust actively working to discredit her. Rebecca held her daughter close, her own face showing horror at how quickly reputation could be weaponized against evidence. Then Morrison made fatal mistake. In his eagerness to defend Thornton and attack Chen's investigation, he revealed knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. Deputy Chen's so-called evidence is fruit of illegal search orchestrated by criminal bikers. The bag she claims to have found was planted after they broke into Coach Thornton's vehicle. I've reviewed her report, and the timeline doesn't support her claims. The statement was meant to undermine Chen's credibility, to suggest conspiracy between deputy and bikers. Instead, it revealed that Morrison had detailed knowledge of evidence that Chen had only secured 20 minutes earlier, that he'd somehow reviewed her report before it was officially filed, that he had access to investigative materials before they'd been processed through proper channels. Chen, standing nearby with FBI agents who'd arrived ahead of schedule, went very still. Lead agent Sarah Martinez, a woman in her 40s with steel gray eyes and expression, suggesting she'd seen every variation of human depravity, turned to Morrison with interest that was purely predatory. Sheriff Morrison, how did you review Deputy Chen's report? She followed it with FBI 10 minutes ago. It hasn't been forwarded to county level. The only way you'd know its contents is if you had direct contact with the suspect before evidence was processed. Morrison's face went purple, realizing too late that he'd revealed connection he should have hidden. Thornton's lawyers immediately began damage control, suggesting Morrison misspoke, that he'd been referring to preliminary verbal report, that media confusion had created misunderstanding. But Martinez wasn't local law enforcement who could be pressured or influenced. She was federal agent with authority that superseded Morrison's, and she'd just witnessed sheriff implicate himself in ongoing obstruction of justice. Sheriff Morrison, I'm going to need you to come with me. We have questions about your handling of previous complaints related to Coach Thornton, specifically regarding families who relocated after filing charges that were subsequently dropped. Morrison's expression cycled through anger to fear to calculation, recognizing that his carefully constructed protection of Thornton had just collapsed under federal scrutiny. He could surrender and cooperate, or he could fight and confirm guilt through resistance. He chose self-preservation. I want immunity before I talk. Full immunity from federal prosecution. Because if you're investigating Thornton's history, you need to understand what I know. And what I know will send him to prison for life. The confession dropped like a bomb into chaos, silencing media circus, shocking lawyers into incoherence, sending Thornton's face through rapid transformation from confident innocence to naked panic. Morrison, faced with choice between protecting corrupt arrangement or saving himself, had chosen betrayal with brutal efficiency. Martinez gestured to other agents who moved to secure both Morrison and Thornton, reading them rights while cameras captured everything. Thornton was screaming about violations and conspiracies, his pleasant mask completely shattered to reveal rage beneath. Morrison was quiet, calculating, already negotiating terms of cooperation that would destroy his former friend while potentially limiting his own consequences. As federal agents led Thornton toward vehicles, he turned his eyes, scanning the crowd, until they found Hammer standing beside Emma. His expression shifted, mask slipping completely, to reveal something cold and cruel that had always lurked beneath its suburban wholesomeness. He mouthed words clearly, precisely knowing Hammer would understand even without sound. Your daughter was sweet too. Such a fighter. The world stopped. Sound faded to white noise. Hammer's vision tunneled, everything peripheral disappearing until only Thornton's face remained, until those 7 words rewrote 8 years of grief and confusion and self-blame into devastating clarity. Olivia, the unsolved case. Peterson investigated and cleared, evidence disappearing. Morrison suggesting they move on for their own healing. It hadn't been Peterson. It had been Thornton, and all along living 2 streets over, volunteering at Olivia's school with access and opportunity and protection from corrupt sheriff who'd buried evidence before investigation could point toward truth. Viper's hand clamped on Hammer's shoulder, his voice urgent in his ear. Don't. Whatever you're thinking, don't. We got him. Legal system has him. If you touch him, you'll destroy everything we've built. Hammer's hands were shaking, his breathing ragged, every instinct screaming to cross the distance, to put his hands around Thornton's throat, to extract physical revenge for Olivia's death and Emma's trauma and all the children whose names appeared on labels in that evidence bag. Justice felt insufficient, legal process felt inadequate, consequences through courts felt like pale shadow of what should be delivered immediately and violently. But Emma was watching him, this brave child who trusted him to do the right thing rather than the satisfying thing. Martinez was watching, evaluating whether these bikers were allies or threats. Chen was watching, hoping her career sacrifice wasn't about to be wasted on vigilante violence that would taint everything. Hammer forced his hands to unclench, forced his breathing to slow, forced himself to step back from edge of action that would feel righteous in the moment and destroy everything later. His voice, when it emerged, was hollow. He killed my daughter 8 years ago, Olivia. He just confessed. Martinez's expression shifted from professional assessment to human understanding, recognition that this wasn't just about Emma, but about legacy of victims stretching back years. She approached Hammer, her voice carrying gravity. Then we'll prove it. We'll reopen her case, test all preserved evidence, interview everyone involved. If Thornton killed your daughter, we'll establish it legally. You have my word. The promise was thin comfort against 8 years of grief, but it was more than Hammer had possessed an hour ago. He nodded, not trusting his voice, his eyes tracking Thornton, being loaded into federal vehicle while cameras captured everything for posterity. Emma approached him, her small hand finding his, her voice containing wisdom no child should possess. You didn't hurt him, you did the right thing. My mom always says doing the right thing is harder than doing the easy thing. Hammer looked down at this remarkable child who'd started this entire chain of events with 7 words spoken to strangers and felt something shift in his chest. Olivia was gone, would never come back, and that grief would never fully heal. But Emma was alive because he'd listened when she spoke, because he'd believed when others dismissed, because he'd learned from past failure and chosen differently. That was legacy worth honoring. That was redemption, incomplete and imperfect, but real. The FBI field office in Helena had transformed an entire floor into command center for what they were now calling Operation Guardian Angel. Name an ironic nod to the bikers whose illegal actions had inadvertently launched the most comprehensive child predation investigation Montana had seen in decades. Lead agent Sarah Martinez stood before whiteboard covered in photographs, names, dates, and connection lines that formed spider web of victimization spanning 8 years in 3 states. Her team had been working 70-hour weeks for 3 weeks straight, and exhaustion showed in everyone's faces. But the determination burning in their eyes suggested they wouldn't stop until every thread had been pulled, every victim identified, every piece of evidence documented with prosecutorial precision. Hammer sat in conference room that smelled like stale coffee and determination, watching Martinez brief her team while Rebecca Hayes sat beside him, her hands wrapped around the styrofoam cup that had gone cold an hour ago. Emma was in another room with trauma specialist Dr. Patricia Holloway, giving formal statement via forensic interview that would be used in court proceedings. The process was gentler than traditional interrogation designed to extract truth without re-traumatizing, but it still required Emma to relive her experiences in detail that would be uncomfortable regardless of how carefully it was handled. Martinez turned from the board, her steel gray eyes settling on Hammer. We've identified 23 victims spanning 8 years. The underwear in Thornton's vehicle belonged to 12 girls. The labels provided dates and initials that allowed us to cross-reference with school records, and we've contacted all families. 16 are willing to testify. The other 7 families are too traumatized to participate, but their statements are documented. She pulled up image on laptop timeline showing Thornton's movements across 3 school districts, pattern of complaints that mysteriously disappeared, families who relocated suddenly after receiving financial settlements from districts eager to avoid scandal. Sheriff Morrison has been surprisingly cooperative. He provided detailed records he kept as insurance against Thornton ever threatening him. Turns out Morrison was covering for Thornton because Thornton had evidence of Morrison's affair with 17-year-old girl 10 years ago. They had mutually assured destruction arrangement. Thornton stayed quiet about Morrison's statutory rape. Morrison buried complaints against Thornton. Rebecca's voice emerged bitter. So my daughter and all those other children suffered because 2 predators were protecting each other. That's exactly what happened. The good news is that Morrison's cooperation gives us paper trail, documenting every buried complaint, every payment to families, every piece of suppressed evidence. His testimony will be devastating at trial. Hammer had been silent throughout the briefing, his mind churning through implications and calculations. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough from disuse. What about Olivia, my daughter? Have you connected Thornton to her case? Martinez's expression softened, professional mask giving way to human sympathy. We reopened the investigation immediately. Original evidence from 8 years ago was poorly stored but not destroyed. DNA samples from under Olivia's fingernails, where she fought back, those were preserved. We ran them against Thornton's DNA collected during his arrest. She paused, clearly calculating how to deliver information that would be simultaneously vindicating and devastating. It's a match. David Thornton killed your daughter. The neighbor, Mr. Peterson, was completely innocent. Morrison pointed the investigation at Peterson specifically to deflect from Thornton, who was volunteering at Olivia's school and had access to her schedule, her routines, her vulnerabilities. The room went silent except for fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the ambient hum of federal office building continuing around them, while Hammer processed confirmation of what Thornton's taunting words had already revealed. 8 years of grief and guilt and wondering. 8 years of torturing himself about what he could have done differently. 8 years of carrying a responsibility for failing to protect his daughter. And the truth was that the system designed to catch predators had actively protected one. Rebecca's hand found her grip surprisingly strong for someone so thin and worn down. I'm so sorry. I can't imagine. You almost lost Emma. If she hadn't been brave enough to speak up, if she hadn't trusted us enough to ask for help, she'd be another name on Thornton's victim list. Maybe worse. The acknowledgement hung between them, shared understanding of how close both their daughters had come to being destroyed by same predator. Martinez returned to the timeline, pointing to specific incidents. Based on Morrison's records and victim statements, Thornton escalated over time. Early victims were molested, but not physically harmed beyond the sexual abuse. Later victims showed signs of increasing violence. Olivia was his first murder pattern, suggests he panicked when she fought back harder than expected, killed her to silence her, then refined his approach with subsequent victims to avoid creating evidence. She indicated several names on the board. 4 other children died in what were ruled accidents or suicides between Olivia and Emma. We're investigating whether Thornton was involved. If we can establish pattern of murder, not just abuse, it changes everything about potential sentencing. Hammer's voice came out flat, emotionless, the tone of someone who'd processed too much trauma to have immediate reactions anymore. He's never getting out of prison. Whether it's life sentence for abuse or death penalty for murder, he dies inside. That's my goal. I've been doing this work for 20 years. I've seen monsters walk because prosecutors couldn't prove intent or juries couldn't stomach believing such nice-seeming people were capable of horror. Not this time. We have evidence, victim testimony, Morrison's confession, and patterns so clear, even defense attorneys won't be able to create reasonable doubt. Door opened and Dr. Holloway emerged with Emma, whose face showed exhaustion, but also relief of having spoken truth and been believed. Rebecca stood immediately crossing to embrace her daughter with fierce protectiveness that came 3 weeks too late but was no less genuine for its delay. Emma looked at Hammer, her voice small but steady. Dr. Holloway says my testimony helped, that telling what happened makes it harder for him to hurt other kids. Is that true? Hammer crouched to her level, his massive frame folding down to meet her eyes. It's absolutely true. You're the bravest person I've ever met. What you did telling the truth when adults didn't want to hear it, trusting strangers because you knew we'd listen, standing firm, even when people tried to dismiss you, that's heroism. Real, genuine heroism. Emma absorbed his words with visible hunger, this child who'd been disbelieved and dismissed suddenly being validated by authority figures who recognized her courage. Her eyes filled, but the tears weren't fear. This time they were relief, exhaustion, the emotional release of being safe enough to finally fall apart. 3 months after Thornton's arrest, the trial began with media circus that transformed Millbrook into unwilling stage for national conversation about predators hiding in plain sight, about corruption enabling abuse, about children whose voices were systematically ignored until crisis forced adults to listen. David Thornton sat at defense table looking diminished, his wholesome coach persona completely shattered, replaced by gaunt, haunted appearance of someone who'd spent 90 days in protective custody after other inmates discovered his crimes and delivered their own preliminary justice through beatings that left him with permanent limp and hearing loss in his left ear. His attorneys, expensive and skilled, had crafted defense strategy that positioned their client as a victim of witch hunt driven by biker intimidation and overzealous federal investigation. They claimed evidence was tainted by illegal search, that Morrison's testimony was coerced by immunity deal, that young victims had been coached by parents seeking financial settlements, that the entire case was house of cards built on hysteria rather than facts. The strategy collapsed under weight of evidence that was overwhelming in its thoroughness. Prosecutor James Walsh, veteran of child exploitation cases, who'd earned reputation for methodical brutality in courtroom, walked jury through forensic documentation that left no room for doubt. DNA evidence from Olivia's case that matched Thornton. 12 pairs of children's underwear with labels in Thornton's handwriting. Morrison's detailed records showing 7 years of buried complaints. 16 victim testimonies from girls ranging from 7 to 14 each describing pattern of grooming abuse and threats that were horrifyingly consistent. Emma testified via closed-circuit television, sparing her from having to face Thornton directly while still allowing jury to assess her credibility. The 9-year-old who'd run to bikers for help spoke clearly despite visible nervousness, describing Coach Thornton's inappropriate questions, the discovery that her underwear was missing, seeing them in his pocket at the fair, the terror of not being believed by Sheriff Morrison. Defense attorneys tried to shake her during cross-examination, suggesting she was confused, that she'd been influenced by her mother or the bikers, that childhood imagination had transformed innocent interactions into sinister narrative. Emma held firm, her voice steady. I know what happened. I'm not confused. He took my underwear and you found them exactly where I said they'd be. I'm not lying and I'm not making things up. I'm telling the truth, and everyone who didn't believe me was wrong. The simple clarity of her statement, delivered without theatrical emotion or coached performance, landed with devastating effect. Several jurors were visibly moved, one wiping tears, another looking at Thornton with expression of pure revulsion. That suggested verdict was already decided in his mind. Sarah Mitchell's mother testified about Morrison pressuring them to leave Millbrook, about the $10,000 settlement that bought their silence, about 3 years of guilt, watching news from Montana, and fearing another family would receive knock on their door because she'd been too afraid to fight. Her testimony established pattern of corruption that explained how Thornton had operated for so long without consequences. Morrison himself took the stand, his former authority completely stripped away, wearing orange jumpsuit from county jail where he awaited his own sentencing for obstruction of justice and corruption. His testimony was clinical detached, the confession of someone who had already accepted that his life as he'd known it was over and was now trying to mitigate damage through cooperation. I received 7 complaints about David Thornton over 7 years. Each time he'd come to me panicking, swearing the child was confused, that he'd done nothing wrong. That false accusation would destroy his career and marriage. And each time he'd remind me that he knew about Samantha, about my relationship with her, when she was 17 and I was 44. His voice remained steady, shame buried under pragmatism. So I'd approach the families, explain that pursuing charges would be difficult, that trial would traumatize their daughters, that school district could offer financial settlement if they'd sign non-disclosure agreement and quietly relocate. Most families took the deal. The ones who insisted on pressing charges, I'd lose evidence, botch procedures, ensure cases collapsed before reaching trial. I protected a child predator for 7 years because he had leverage over me. 23 children were victimized because I was a coward. Defense tried to undermine Morrison's credibility, suggesting his testimony was fabrication designed to reduce his own sentence. But his detailed records, corroborated by paper trail from school district settlements and victim family bank deposits, created documentation that was impossible to dismiss as fantasy or coercion. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Jury deliberated for 4 hours. Verdict came back unanimous on all counts: 23 counts of child sexual abuse, 5 counts of producing child pornography, 5 counts of first-degree murder, including Olivia's death, 7 counts of witness tampering, 3 counts of kidnapping. Each guilty verdict landed like hammer blow, Thornton's face going progressively paler, his expensive lawyers shuffling papers with expressions suggesting they'd known this outcome was inevitable, but had gone through motions anyway. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to the disgraced sheriff, read sentencing with voice that carried both legal authority and personal disgust. 5 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole to be served in supermax facility with 23-hour isolation for his own protection. The only mercy was that Montana had abolished death penalty, sparing Thornton execution, but guaranteeing he'd spend remaining decades in concrete box that measured 8 by 10 feet, seeing daylight for 1 hour per day, dying slowly from isolation, and the knowledge that justice, however delayed, had finally caught him. Thornton was led away in chains, his limp from jail beating, making his exit shuffling and pathetic, no longer the confident coach who charmed communities into trusting him with their children. He looked at Hammer once as he passed, his eyes carrying hatred and confusion that someone so far outside the system had been the one to destroy him. Hammer watched him disappear through courthouse doors with expression that mixed satisfaction and emptiness. Justice had been served, his daughter's murder, solved, predator, imprisoned forever. But Olivia was still dead, 8 years stolen, that could never be recovered. Childhood innocence shattered for 23 victims whose lives were permanently altered. Rebecca found him outside the courthouse, Emma holding her hand, both wearing exhausted relief of people who'd survived ordeal that had tested every aspect of their resilience. It's over. He can't hurt anyone else. Hammer nodded slowly, his voice rough. Olivia can rest now. She tried to tell me, and I didn't listen. Emma tried to tell you, and eventually you did. That's the difference between tragedy and survival. Emma looked up at him with old soul wisdom. Miss Martinez says you believing me saved other kids too, that he was planning to hurt more children before you stopped him. So your daughter's death taught you something that saved lives. That matters. The observation was too insightful for 9-year-old, too painful in its accuracy to accept easily. But Emma was right. Olivia's death had taught Hammer to listen when children spoke, had made him hypervigilant about dismissing accusations, had ensured that when Emma approached him, he'd believed her immediately rather than requiring additional proof. That lesson, purchased with his daughter's life, had prevented additional deaths. It wasn't fair. exchange wasn't adequate compensation, but it transformed meaningless tragedy into purposeful loss. 6 months after the trial, Emma sat in Dr. Holloway's office for twice-weekly therapy session that was slowly incrementally helping her process trauma that would mark her forever but didn't have to define her. The nightmares had decreased from nightly to occasional, the hypervigilance around adult men had softened slightly, the fear that she'd be disbelieved had begun yielding to confidence that her voice mattered. Rebecca had quit her job at the diner using portion of victim restitution fund to enroll in nursing program that would provide stable career and better income. They'd moved to a small apartment that was cleaner and safer than their previous housing building life. That wasn't just survival, but actual living. The financial settlement from school district lawsuit had been placed in trust for Emma's college education, ensuring her future had possibilities that poverty wouldn't limit. Emma asked to visit Morrison's garage, the clubhouse where Hell's Angels crew spent their days rebuilding motorcycles and their evenings planning the community outreach programs that had emerged from crisis. Rebecca drove her there on Saturday afternoon when the fair weather made Montana almost pleasant, parking beside row of gleaming Harleys that represented brotherhood and loyalty and protection. Hammer was working on engine rebuild when they arrived, his massive hands surprisingly delicate with tools, his concentration absolute. He looked up as Emma approached, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile that transformed his intimidating appearance into something approaching grandfatherly warmth. "Emma, good to see you. How are you doing?" Emma settled onto workbench stool, watching his hands move across engine components with fascination. "Dr. Holloway says I'm making progress. I still have bad dreams sometimes, but not as much, and I'm not scared all the time anymore." "That's good. Healing takes time. You're allowed to go at your own pace." Emma was quiet for a moment, gathering courage for questions she'd been building toward. "Miss Martinez said you had a daughter who died, the one Coach Thornton killed. Is that why you believe me?" The question hung between them, child's directness cutting through adult tendency toward evasion. Hammer set down his wrench, giving Emma his full attention with respect she deserved. "Yes, her name was Olivia. She was 7 when something started bothering her. She tried to tell me she felt uncomfortable around certain adults, that something was wrong. I was too busy, too distracted, too convinced that bad things couldn't happen in our neighborhood to people like us. I didn't listen the way I should have. 2 weeks later, she was dead." His voice remained steady, but pain leaked through despite control. "When you walked up to me at the fair and told me what happened, I saw Olivia. I saw my second chance. I couldn't save her, but I could save you. You gave me opportunity to do better, to honor her memory by protecting you the way I failed to protect her." Emma absorbed this, her 9-year-old mind processing complex ideas about guilt and redemption and how tragedies could create purposes if people chose to learn rather than just grieve. "I'm sorry your daughter died. I'm grateful you lived. You taught me that listening to children when they speak up, really listening, not just hearing, is the most important thing adults can do. That's Olivia's legacy. That's how her death meant something." Emma nodded slowly, then reached out and placed her small hand over his scarred, grease-stained one. "Then I'm glad I found you. Even though what happened was scary and bad, I'm glad it led me to someone who would believe me." The simple statement carried more healing than months of therapy validation, that his failure with Olivia had been transformed into success with Emma, that growth was possible even from deepest grief. Hammer felt something shift in his chest, grief that had been solid and impenetrable, developing cracks that might eventually let light through. The Hells Angels chapter had transformed in year following the trial, their reputation shifting from intimidating outsiders to protective guardians who'd literally saved children when official systems failed. They'd established Olivia's Hope nonprofit organization focused on child safety education and providing resources for abuse victims. The organization was funded by portion of the club's legitimate business income plus donations from community members who'd watched bikers accomplish what Sheriff couldn't. Viper ran self-defense classes, teaching children how to set boundaries and escape dangerous situations. Ghost facilitated support groups for former foster youth, using his own experiences to help others navigate system trauma. Skull expanded his youth outreach work, partnering with schools to educate students about recognizing grooming behavior and safe adults to approach. Marcus organized motorcycle safety courses that doubled his mentorship programs, building relationships with at-risk teenagers who needed positive male role models. Hammer became face of the organization, this imposing figure whose appearance had once frightened children, now representing safety and belief. He spoke at schools, gave interviews about trusting children's instincts, partnered with law enforcement agencies to improve response protocols when abuse was reported. His transformation from intimidating biker to child safety advocate became story local media covered extensively, redemption narrative that Montana embraced with enthusiasm that made Hammer uncomfortable but accepted as necessary for the mission. Claire Thornton filed for divorce 30 days after her husband's conviction, issued public statement that went viral within hours of its release. I saw warning signs and chose to ignore them. I told myself David's relationships with his students were just dedication to teaching. I explained away the late nights, the defensive behavior, when I asked questions, the way he was secretive with his phone and computer. I chose my comfort over children's safety. I chose believing my husband over believing victims who tried to speak up. That makes me complicit. I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life, and no apology is adequate for the harm my willful blindness enabled. The statement was remarkable in its raw acknowledgement of failure, refusing to position herself as victim and accepting responsibility that most enabling spouses avoided through denial or blame shifting. She donated her share of marital assets to Olivia's Hope, sold their house, and moved to a different state, accepting that she'd destroyed whatever future she'd imagined and needed to rebuild from ruins her choices had created. Pastor Michael Hayes appeared on Rebecca's doorstep one evening 6 months post-trial, his weathered face showing shame and determination in equal measure. Rebecca hadn't spoken to her father in 4 years, their relationship destroyed by his judgment of her single parenthood, her financial struggles, her life choices that deviated from his vision of proper Christian living. I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you dozens of apologies spanning years. But I'll start with this one. I was wrong about how I treated you and Emma. I judged your life instead of supporting it. I condemned your choices instead of helping you build better ones. And my pride, my certainty that I knew best, meant Emma didn't have grandfather she needed when she was being victimized. Rebecca stood in the doorway, arms crossed, defenses constructed from years of paternal disapproval. You called me irresponsible, said I was unfit mother, suggested Emma would be better off in foster care than with me. I know, I was cruel and wrong. You raised daughter who had courage to speak truth when adults wouldn't listen. That's better parenting than I ever managed. I taught my children to respect authority without question, to trust leaders because of their positions, to never make waves that might disrupt social order. You taught Emma to trust her instincts and speak up even when it was terrifying. Your way saved her life. My way would have gotten her killed. The admission hung between them, father acknowledging that daughter he judged as failure had succeeded where his rigid principles would have catastrophically failed. Rebecca's defenses didn't crumble. Years of hurt couldn't be erased by single apology, but hairline cracks appeared possibility that relationship might be rebuilt if both parties chose difficult work of reconstruction. Emma needs her grandfather. I'm not promising everything's fine between us, but she deserves family and you deserve chance to know the remarkable child your granddaughter is becoming. Pastor Hayes's eyes filled gratitude and relief mixing with acknowledgement that he'd nearly lost access to family through his own rigidity. Thank you. I don't deserve your grace, but I'll spend however long it takes earning it. 1 year after Emma had spoken 7 words that changed everything, Millbrook County Fair returned with determined cheerfulness that felt both defiant and appropriate. The fairground had been the site of trauma and also the beginning of justice, and the community had decided to reclaim the space rather than letting Thornton's crimes taint it permanently. This year, the fair included Children's Safety Day event, organized by Olivia's Hope, and featuring educational booths, self-defense demonstrations, and speakers who addressed child protection with age-appropriate messaging. Emma had volunteered to speak decision that made Rebecca simultaneously proud and terrified. Standing before a crowd of hundreds talking about her trauma, publicly risked re-traumatization. But Dr. Holloway had assessed Emma's readiness and concluded that controlled storytelling, with agency and purpose, could be healing rather than harmful, allowing Emma to reclaim her narrative and position herself as survivor rather than victim. Hammer stood at the edge of the crowd, Viper beside him, both wearing their leather vests with new Olivia's Hope patches sewn prominently over their hearts. Ghost and Skull were scattered through the gathering, providing security that was both protective and symbolic the guardians who'd listened when authority figures failed, now ensuring that this space was genuinely safe. Emma took the temporary stage microphone slightly too tall for her small frame until someone adjusted it downward. She wore yellow sundress similar to the one from year ago, deliberate choice to reclaim color that had been associated with worst day of her life. Her hands gripped note cards she'd written with Dr. Holloway's help. Insurance against freezing if anxiety overwhelmed her. She looked at the crowd, took deep breath, and began speaking with voice that started uncertain but grew stronger with each sentence. My name is Emma Hayes. I'm 10 years old. A year ago, something bad happened to me at this fair. Someone I trusted hurt me, stole something from me, made me feel unsafe. I was scared to tell adults because I thought they wouldn't believe me. I thought they'd say I was confused or making things up or trying to get attention. Her voice steadied, confidence building. But then I saw these bikers. She gestured toward where Hammer and his crew stood. And even though they looked scary, something told me they'd listen. They looked like the kind of people who believe bad things exist so they wouldn't pretend mine didn't happen. And I was right. They believed me when other adults didn't. They protected me when other adults protected the person who hurt me. Parents in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Recognition that Emma was describing institutional failure. They'd all witnessed complicity they might have shared had it been their community leader accused rather than someone else's coach. I learned that speaking up is scary, but staying quiet is worse. I learned that the adults who seem safest aren't always safe, and the adults who seem scary aren't always dangerous. I learned that I deserved to be believed even when believing me was inconvenient for grown-ups. Her voice dropped slightly, becoming more intimate. If something bad is happening to you, tell someone. Keep telling until someone listens, because there are people who will believe you. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to be heard. And if the first adult you tell doesn't help find another adult, keep trying until you find someone like Hammer. She looked directly at him. Someone who treats your words like they matter more than their comfort. Standing ovation erupted, thunderous applause that lasted minutes. People rising to their feet to honor this remarkable child who'd transformed trauma into advocacy, who'd taken worst experience and alchemized it into message that might save other children from similar fates. Hammer's eyes were wet grief and pride mixing into emotions too complex to name. He'd failed Olivia but succeeded with Emma, and watching this 10-year-old speak with authority about survival and believing children felt like his daughter's death had been redeemed into meaning he'd thought impossible. After the event, Emma approached him with folded piece of paper, her expression shy but determined. I made something for you. She handed him the paper, watching his face as he unfolded it carefully. The drawing showed girl in bright yellow dress standing beside massive biker, both smiling, motorcycle and background sun overhead. The title written in careful crayon, My Guardian Angel. Hammer's throat closed, making speech impossible. He folded the drawing with reverence typically reserved for sacred texts, pulling out his wallet and tucking it beside worn photograph of Olivia that he'd carried for 8 years. 2 daughters, one lost, one saved, both teaching him lessons about protection and belief and the importance of listening when children found courage to speak. Emma hugged him, her arms barely reaching around his midsection, her small body transmitting trust and affection that 8-year-old Hammer had thought he'd lost forever when Olivia died. Thank you for believing me. Thank you for being someone I could trust when I had nobody else. Hammer's voice emerged rough with emotion. Thank you for being brave enough to speak. Thank you for teaching me to listen. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever: purpose. Reason to keep going, proof that sometimes we get second chances if we're wise enough to recognize them. Rebecca joined them, their relationship with her father slowly rebuilding her nursing program. Halfway complete, her life transformed from survival mode into actual living. She looked at Hammer with gratitude that transcended words. You saved her. I'll never be able to repay that. You don't owe me anything. She saved herself by speaking up. We just made sure her voice was heard. The sun set over the fairground, painting everything in gold and purple light that transformed the scene from mundane to magical. Children played freely under watchful eyes of parents and bikers, the terror having been exorcised through justice and replaced with purposeful protection. Olivia's Hope volunteers distributed information pamphlets. Hell's Angels crew demonstrated motorcycle safety. Emma laughed with friends who treated her not as victim, but his hero. Hammer stood beside his Harley, watching Emma play his hand, unconsciously moving to his wallet, where two photographs lived: Olivia's gap-toothed smile and Emma's crayon guardian angel. The grief would never fully disappear. The guilt about failing Olivia would always haunt quiet moments, but it had transformed from crushing weight into purposeful burden. His daughter's death had taught him the most important lesson: when children speak, you listen. Always listen. That lesson had saved Emma's life and prevented 23 other children from becoming Thornton's victims after her. It had transformed Hammer from grieving father into guardian from man, defined by loss, into man characterized by protection. Olivia's legacy wasn't her death. It was the lives saved because her father learned to hear what children were trying to communicate beneath their words. Emma approached one final time, and as families began departing, the fair lights coming on against gathering darkness, transforming the scene into carnival brightness that felt genuinely safe this time rather than harboring hidden dangers. "Will you be here next year at the fair?" Hammer's smiled expression, softening his intimidating features. "Wouldn't miss it. Someone needs to make sure you stay out of trouble." "I'm not in trouble anymore. I'm the girl who speaks up when things are wrong. I'm the girl who found guardian angels at County Fair. I'm the girl who knows that being heard is more important than being liked." The self-definition was remarkable: trauma integrated into identity without defining it, strength forged from crisis rather than being destroyed by it. Hammer recognized that Emma would carry scars forever, that some nights would be harder than others, that healing wasn't linear and recovery wasn't complete. But she'd survived, had grown stronger in broken places, had become advocate for others, still trapped in situations she'd escaped. That was victory, imperfect and incomplete, but real. As Emma walked away holding her mother's hand, her yellow dress bright against gathering darkness, Hammer thought about the journey from that afternoon a year ago, when small voice had cut through fairground noise with 7 devastating words. "Sir, he has my panties on him." Those words had destroyed predators' carefully constructed facade, had exposed corruption, enabling abuse, had transformed biker crew from intimidating outsiders into community protectors. Sometimes heroes didn't wear badges or carry official authority. Sometimes they wore leather and rode motorcycles and looked dangerous enough that children recognized they'd be believed when they spoke uncomfortable truths. Sometimes protection came from unexpected sources delivered by people society dismissed as outlaws, but who understood that real justice required choosing right action over convenient inaction. Hammer mounted his Harley, the engine's growl familiar and comforting vibrations steady beneath him as he prepared to ride home. Tomorrow he'd return to the garage, to the nonprofit work, to the speaking engagements and school visits that had become his purpose. Tomorrow he'd continue honoring Olivia's memory by protecting children she'd never meet, by listening to voices that might otherwise be dismissed, by being guardian to those who needed guardians. But tonight, riding through Montana darkness with stars overhead and roads stretching endlessly forward, he allowed himself to feel something approaching peace. Emma was safe. Thornton was imprisoned. Justice had been served. And 2 photographs in his wallet represented not just loss, but also continuity. His daughter's death teaching lessons that saved another father's daughter. Tragedy transformed into purpose. Grief alchemized into protection. The wind carried his thoughts away, dispersing them into desert night that absorbed everything and offered nothing back except space to exist. Hammer rode through darkness toward home guardian in leather and grief protector, shaped by failure into someone who wouldn't fail again. Father who'd learned the hardest way that children's voices were most important thing adults could choose to hear. Behind him, Millbrook County Fair continued, its rotation lights blazing against darkness, children's laughter echoing across space where trauma had occurred and healing had begun. The scariest-looking people had proven safest. The most intimidating presence had become most protective. And one 9-year-old girl's courage to speak 7 words to strangers had saved not just herself, but countless others who would never know how close they'd come to being next victims. That was legacy worth leaving. That was redemption, hard-earned and incomplete, but genuine. And in some dimension beyond comprehension, perhaps Olivia Cross watched her father finally understand the lesson her death had taught him, finally forgive himself for not listening sooner, finally recognize that her life mattered not just for its tragic ending, but for what it had created in its aftermath. A guardian who would never stop listening, never stop protecting, never stopped believing that children deserved adults who took their words seriously enough to act. The guardian angels wore leather, and they were still watching.